You ever notice how the quietest guy in a military hangar is usually the one everyone should be afraid of? Rain hammered the corrugated steel roof of Hangar 12 hard enough to rattle the suspended work lights overhead, each metallic impact echoing through the massive aviation bay like distant rotor fire. The smell of jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and wet concrete hung thick in the cold evening air while a gray C-130 Hercules sat motionless beneath fluorescent lights, its enormous fuselage glowing dull silver through the storm haze drifting in from the runway. Marines moved through the hangar in clusters, shouting over the noise of generators and maintenance carts, their boots squeaking against the polished concrete floor as thunder rolled somewhere beyond the airfield perimeter. Near the far end of the hangar, beneath the shadow of the transport plane's left wing, an old man stood completely still beside a stack of weathered cargo crates. He looked out of place in every possible way. His faded green parka hung loose over thin shoulders, the fabric stained dark from rainwater. A worn backpack rested at his boots beside a rolled sleeping bag tied together with fraying cord. White stubble covered his jawline, and strands of silver hair clung damply to his forehead beneath the flickering lights. To most of the Marines moving around the aircraft, he looked like another homeless drifter who had slipped through base security looking for warmth before the storm got worse. Corporal Ethan Briggs noticed him first. "You gotta be kidding me," Briggs muttered, grabbing a wrench off a nearby tool cart before striding toward the old man with the swagger of somebody who had never once been told no in his entire military career. At 23 years old, Briggs carried himself like the hangar belonged to him. His sleeves were rolled perfectly. His boots looked fresh out of supply issue. Even the younger mechanics nearby straightened slightly when he walked past them. "Hey," Briggs barked over the noise of the storm, pointing the wrench toward the old man. "This isn't a shelter, old-timer." Several Marines nearby glanced over immediately, sensing entertainment. The old man didn't respond. He simply kept his pale blue eyes fixed on the aircraft above him, almost like he was listening to something buried deep inside the machine itself. Briggs smirked and looked back toward the others. Guy probably wandered in from the highway. A couple mechanics laughed. One of them raised a phone slightly, already recording. Rainwater dripped steadily from the old man's sleeves onto the concrete floor. He still said nothing. Briggs stepped closer now, irritation growing beneath the performance. "You deaf or something?" he asked. "Security's gonna throw you out in about 30 seconds. The old man finally moved, but only slightly. His gaze drifted slowly from the aircraft down toward Briggs' chest patch before returning to the Hercules again. Calm. Unbothered. Like the younger Marine barely existed. That silence hit Briggs harder than an insult would have. The laughter around them grew louder. "Look at this guy," one mechanic snorted. "Probably thinks he flew these things back in Vietnam." Briggs grinned. "Yeah. Maybe he was Top Gun." More laughter echoed through the hangar. Then Briggs noticed something strange. The old man wasn't standing randomly beneath the aircraft. He was standing directly below a faded insignia painted near the cargo door. A black emblem almost invisible beneath years of maintenance repainting. Most Marines on base probably never even noticed it anymore. But the old man's eyes never left it. Not once. Thunder shook the building again. Somewhere deeper inside the hangar, an engine starter whined briefly before cutting out with a metallic cough. The old man closed his eyes for half a second when he heard the sound, like he recognized it. Briggs folded his arms. "All right, Grandpa," he said loudly, making sure everyone nearby could hear him. "Let's hear it. What exactly were you supposed to be back in the day?" Slowly, almost reluctantly, the old man turned toward him at last. The fluorescent lights caught his face fully for the first time, revealing tired eyes that somehow still looked sharp enough to cut steel. When he finally spoke, his voice came out low, rough, and steady beneath the storm outside. "That's not what they called us." The laughter around the hangar softened slightly. Briggs smirked wider. "Oh yeah?" he asked. "Then what did they call you?" The old man looked back toward the aircraft one final time before answering. Reaper storm. The hangar went cold. For 3 long seconds, nobody in Hangar 12 moved. The rain still hammered the roof overhead. Generators still rumbled near the maintenance bay. Somewhere across the flight line, a warning siren groaned through the storm like a distant ship horn. But around the old man beneath the Hercules, the laughter had died completely. Corporal Ethan Briggs blinked once, then scoffed loudly enough to force the tension away from himself. Reaper storm, he repeated with a grin. What kind of fake action movie nonsense is that? A couple younger mechanics laughed again, but it sounded weaker now. Forced. Nervous. Briggs pointed toward the old man with the wrench still hanging loosely in his hand. That is not even an MOS. The old man said nothing. Water dripped from the edge of his parka sleeve onto the concrete floor in slow steady taps. His eyes remained fixed on the aircraft above them, specifically the faded insignia near the cargo hatch. Briggs noticed it again and frowned slightly. You hearing me? He pressed. Marine occupational specialty. Simple question. You were a mechanic? Infantry? Cook? The old man finally answered without looking at him. None of those. His voice was calm enough to make Briggs even more irritated. Right, Briggs muttered. Of course. Behind him, one of the younger Marines zoomed his phone camera closer. Maybe he was some secret assassin, the mechanic joked. Careful, another laughed. He might disappear us all. This time almost nobody joined in. Near the edge of the hangar, Master Sergeant Cole Ramirez had stopped walking altogether. He stood beside a rolling toolbox with one hand resting lightly against the handle, his expression tightening as he studied the old man from across the bay. Ramirez had spent 26 years around military aircraft. He knew the sound every engine made before startup. He knew the smell of overheated hydraulics. And he knew when a room changed temperature because somebody dangerous had walked into it. The younger Marines felt it too, even if they did not understand why. Briggs still tried to force the moment back under his control. All right then, he said loudly. Tell us what Reaper Storm means. The old man finally looked directly at him. Pale blue eyes. Cold as winter steel beneath the fluorescent lights. It means enough people died already, he said quietly. The words landed harder than shouting would have. One of the mechanics near the fuel cart slowly lowered his phone. Thunder rolled again outside, rattling the massive hangar doors. Briggs opened his mouth to fire back another joke, but a sharp metallic clang suddenly cut through the bay. Everybody turned. A wrench had slipped from somebody's hand near the maintenance scaffold and bounced loudly across the concrete floor before spinning to a stop. The mechanic who dropped it was older than the others, a civilian contractor named Pete Holloway. Gray beard. Former Air Force. 20 years around combat aircraft. And right now, he looked pale. Pete stared at the old man beneath the Hercules with wide unfocused eyes. No way, he whispered under his breath. Briggs frowned immediately. What? Pete swallowed once. Hard. Nothing. But it was not nothing. Ramirez saw it instantly. Fear. Real fear. The kind trained military personnel only showed when they recognized something they wished they did not. Ramirez walked forward slowly now, boots echoing across the polished concrete. The old man still had not moved from beneath the aircraft wing. Sir, Ramirez said carefully, where did you hear that name? The old man glanced toward him for the first time. Something changed in Ramirez immediately when their eyes met. Not anger. Not intimidation. Recognition. The old man studied him for a second before answering. Same place you did. Ramirez felt the blood drain from his face. Briggs looked between them, confused now. Hold on, he said with a nervous laugh. You guys seriously know what this is? Neither man answered him. Rain hissed against the hangar roof overhead while the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly in the silence. Then the old man slowly reached down beside his sleeping bag and rested one weathered hand against an old canvas backpack stained dark with age and oil. A small faded patch was sewn into the side pocket. Black thread. Nearly worn smooth by time. Ramirez stared at it like he had seen a ghost. Because stitched into the center of the patch was the exact same insignia painted beneath the Hercules cargo door. The sound of the storm outside seemed farther away now. Smaller somehow. Inside Hangar 12, every eye had settled on the faded black patch stitched into the side of the old canvas backpack. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly while rainwater crept beneath the massive hangar doors in thin silver streams across the concrete floor. Nobody laughed anymore. Corporal Ethan Briggs looked from the patch to the matching insignia painted beneath the Hercules cargo hatch and felt the confidence drain slowly out of his chest. "What is this?" he asked, trying to force a smirk that no longer reached his face. Pete Holloway did not answer immediately. The older contractor kept staring at the patch like it was something radioactive. "Pete," Briggs pressed. "You know this thing or not?" Pete swallowed hard before finally speaking. "I saw that symbol once before." His voice had gone quieter than normal. "Careful. 20 years ago. Different aircraft. Different base." Ramirez shifted slightly beside him. "Where?" Pete rubbed one hand slowly across his beard without taking his eyes off the old man. "Nevada." The word hung heavily in the cold air. A couple younger Marines exchanged confused looks. Briggs folded his arms again, though the gesture felt weaker now. "So what? It is some old squadron patch." Pete looked at him sharply. "No," that single word stopped Briggs cold. The old man beneath the Hercules remained motionless. He looked almost tired now, like somebody who had spent too many years carrying things nobody else could see. Ramirez took another slow step forward. "Sir," he said carefully, "that insignia was scrubbed from command records years ago." The old man nodded once. "Supposed to be." The fluorescent lights flickered overhead for half a second as thunder rolled outside again. Somewhere deeper in the hangar, a tow tractor engine shut down with a low mechanical growl that echoed briefly through the bay before silence settled back over the aircraft. Briggs forced out a nervous laugh. "Okay, enough with the secret agent stuff." He pointed toward the patch again. "You expect us to believe this is classified?" The old man looked at him with the same calm expression that had unsettled him from the beginning. "No," he said softly. "I expect you not to." Briggs opened his mouth again, but Ramirez cut him off without even looking away from the old man. "Corporal. Stop talking." The sharpness in the master sergeant's voice snapped across the hangar like a rifle crack. Briggs blinked in surprise. Ramirez never embarrassed junior Marines publicly unless something was seriously wrong. And right now, Ramirez looked deeply unsettled. He crouched slightly near the backpack, studying the worn patch more closely. Black thread. Circular insignia. Almost faded completely away except for one detail still visible beneath decades of wear. A narrow silver shape cutting through the center like a blade. Ramirez felt his stomach tighten instantly. He had seen that symbol once before too. Not in person. In an old briefing room at Camp Pendleton almost 15 years ago during a closed aviation survival seminar. Most of the presentation had been redacted. Entire sections blacked out. But one slide remained burned into his memory because the instructor had stopped speaking completely when it appeared on screen. A black insignia. A silver slash through the middle. And beneath it, 2 words. Reaper Storm. Ramirez slowly stood back up. "Sir," he asked carefully, "how many are left?" For the first time, something changed in the old man's face. Not fear. Not anger. Grief. quiet and heavy behind pale blue eyes. He glanced up toward the Hercules above him, following the faded insignia along the metal skin of the aircraft like he was tracing ghosts nobody else could see. Not enough, he answered. Nobody spoke after that. Rain hissed against the runway outside while cold air drifted through the hangar bay carrying the smell of wet asphalt and jet fuel. Briggs shifted uncomfortably now. The old man no longer looked homeless to him. He no longer looked harmless either. He looked like something older than the base itself. Something buried. Then one of the younger mechanics frowned suddenly and pointed toward the aircraft tail section. "Wait," he said quietly. "If that patch is real, why is the same insignia painted on the Hercules?" Every head in the hangar slowly turned toward the aircraft. The old man closed his eyes briefly before answering. "Because," he said softly, "that bird belonged to us." For a moment, nobody inside Hangar 12 seemed capable of speaking. The Hercules loomed above them beneath the fluorescent lights like a sleeping giant, its weathered gray fuselage streaked with rainwater blown through the partially opened hangar doors. Wind moaned faintly through the steel beams overhead while distant runway lights flickered across the storm outside. Corporal Ethan Briggs stared at the aircraft with growing confusion. "Belong to you?" he repeated slowly. "What does that even mean?" The old man did not answer immediately. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on the transport plane, tracing old lines in the metal skin almost nobody else noticed anymore. Beneath decades of repainting and maintenance, small scars still marked the aircraft. Tiny ripples near the cargo frame. Uneven rivets along the lower paneling. To every Marine in the hangar, it looked like an old military transport nearing retirement. To him, it looked alive. "This airframe used to carry a different tail number," the old man said quietly at last. "Different markings too." Pete Holloway shifted uneasily. "That is impossible," one younger mechanic muttered nearby. "This bird has been stationed here since before I enlisted." "Not before him," Ramirez answered without taking his eyes off the old man. Briggs looked between them again, irritation now mixing with discomfort. "Okay, enough," he snapped. "Everybody is acting like this guy walked out of some classified ghost story." The old man finally looked directly at him again. Calm. Steady. Almost tired. "Most ghost stories come from somewhere, son." Briggs scoffed, but it came out weaker this time. Across the hangar, one of the maintenance crews restarted an auxiliary power cart. The low turbine whine rolled through the bay while amber warning lights reflected off the Hercules cockpit windows high above them. The sound made the old man's expression tighten slightly. Not fear. Memory. Ramirez noticed immediately. "You know that sound," he said carefully. The old man nodded once. "I used to hear it before bad nights." Silence settled again. Rain hammered harder against the roof now, loud enough to shake dust from the overhead rafters. Briggs shoved his hands into his pockets and looked away toward the aircraft nose section. "So what?" he muttered. "You flew on this thing?" The old man gave a faint shake of his head. "No," he paused briefly. "I brought people home on it." Something about the way he said it made the air feel heavier. Pete Holloway rubbed his face slowly with one hand before stepping closer to Ramirez. "Cole," he whispered carefully, "you remember the old stories from Nellis?" Ramirez did not answer immediately. He remembered. Aviation crews talked sometimes late at night after long maintenance shifts when younger personnel were gone and the coffee had gone cold. Stories about aircraft with erased serial numbers. Cargo flights that never appeared on schedules. Crews without official unit patches. Men who landed in places no aircraft were supposed to survive. Most people dismissed the stories as military folklore. But standing here now beneath the old Hercules, Ramirez no longer felt certain. Briggs still tried to force himself back into control of the room. "All right," he said loudly. "If this is all real, prove it." Pete immediately looked nervous. "Corporal," Briggs ignored him. "You say this aircraft belonged to your unit? Fine. Tell me something nobody else here would know." The old man studied him silently for several seconds while thunder rolled across the airfield outside. Then his eyes drifted upward toward the left side of the fuselage near the wing root. "Panel C-17, he said quietly. "Inside wall behind the insulation." Briggs frowned. "What about it?" "There is a name scratched into the metal." Briggs smirked immediately. "Anybody could say that." "3 names," the old man corrected softly. "Miller, Graves, and Navarro." Pete Holloway suddenly inhaled sharply beside the toolbox. Ramirez turned toward him instantly. "What?" Pete looked pale again. "Navarro," he whispered. "Jesus Christ." Briggs stared at him. "What now?" Pete slowly pointed toward the aircraft. Frank Navarro was one of the original crew chiefs assigned to this Hercules in 1987. The younger Marines looked confused again. "How do you know that?" one mechanic asked. Pete swallowed hard. "Because I trained under him." Nobody spoke after that. The old man simply stood beneath the wing while rain hissed beyond the hangar doors and cold fluorescent light reflected across the aging aircraft above him like pale moonlight on water. Then, for the first time all night, Master Sergeant Ramirez reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The moment Master Sergeant Cole Ramirez unlocked his phone, the atmosphere inside Hangar 12 changed again. It was subtle at first. A tightening in shoulders. The quiet scrape of boots against concrete as Marines instinctively stepped back from the old man beneath the Hercules wing. Rain hammered the roof overhead hard enough to vibrate the steel support beams while cold air drifted through the open hangar doors carrying the sharp smell of wet asphalt and jet exhaust from the runway outside. Ramirez stared down at his screen for several long seconds before slowly looking back up at the old man. "You should not be here," he said quietly. The old man gave the faintest shrug beneath his faded green parka. "Needed someplace dry." Briggs let out a nervous laugh. "Come on, Master Sergeant. You are seriously buying into this?" Ramirez ignored him completely. His thumb moved quickly across the phone screen while his eyes remained locked on the old man. Pete Holloway noticed immediately what Ramirez was doing and looked suddenly alarmed. "Cole," Pete whispered carefully, "you are not actually calling." "Yes," Ramirez answered flatly. Briggs frowned. "Calling who?" Ramirez did not answer. Instead, he turned and walked away from the aircraft toward a narrow office overlooking the maintenance floor. The glass windows above the hangar reflected pale white under the fluorescent lights while thunder rolled outside again, long and low across the airfield. Briggs stared after him in disbelief. "This is insane." But even he sounded uncertain now. The younger Marines nearby remained silent. Nobody wanted to joke anymore. Something about the old man beneath the aircraft had shifted the mood of the entire hangar into unfamiliar territory. He still stood perfectly calm beside the canvas backpack and sleeping bag, hands resting loosely at his sides while rainwater dripped steadily from the edge of his sleeves. He looked less like a homeless drifter now and more like somebody who had simply stepped out of another time entirely. Above the hangar floor, Ramirez entered the office and shut the door behind him. The muffled noise of generators and maintenance crews faded slightly as he pulled down the window blinds with one sharp motion. Then he stared at the contact number glowing on his screen. He had not touched that number in over 8 years. Most personnel on base did not even know the line existed. Ramirez hesitated for half a second before pressing call. The line rang once. Then immediately connected. "Command Operations," a calm voice answered. Ramirez lowered his voice instinctively. "This is Master Sergeant Cole Ramirez, Marine Aviation Logistics." "Go ahead." Ramirez glanced through the office window toward the old man standing beneath the Hercules far below. I need verification on a restricted identifier. Silence. Then the voice answered carefully. Proceed. Ramirez swallowed once. Reaper storm. Nothing happened for 3 full seconds. No response. No background noise. Just silence on the line. Then the calm voice disappeared completely. Stand by. The line clicked. Ramirez felt cold sweat gather beneath his collar. Down below on the hangar floor, Briggs paced beside the Hercules nose wheel while the younger Marines whispered among themselves. This is ridiculous, he muttered. One old guy says some spooky code word and suddenly everybody loses their minds. Pete Holloway leaned against the toolbox with folded arms. You are too young to understand what happens when certain names come back. Briggs scoffed. You do not even know what Reaper Storm means. Pete looked toward the old man beneath the wing. No, he admitted quietly. That is the problem. The storm outside intensified. Rain lashed sideways across the runway lights while distant aircraft warning beacons blinked red through the darkness beyond the hangar doors. Then every light inside Hangar 12 flickered once. The old man slowly lifted his eyes toward the ceiling as if listening to something nobody else could hear. Upstairs in the office, Ramirez suddenly straightened. The line had reconnected. But this time the voice answering was different. Older. Sharper. Master Sergeant Ramirez. Ramirez immediately stood straighter without realizing it. Sir. Repeat exactly what you said. Ramirez glanced down through the office glass toward the old man below. The old man did not move. The identifier is Reaper Storm, sir. Silence again. Then a single question came back through the line. Is the man still there? Ramirez felt the temperature in the room drop. Yes, sir. Another pause. Longer this time. Then the voice returned low and controlled. Do not let him leave the hangar. Master Sergeant Cole Ramirez remained perfectly still inside the dark office overlooking Hangar 12 while the voice on the secure line spoke again. Listen carefully, the older man said. His tone carried the kind of authority that erased hesitation instantly. Nobody outside your hangar is aware that identifier has resurfaced. Do you understand? Ramirez tightened his grip on the phone. Yes, sir. Good. You are going to keep that man there until further notice. Ramirez glanced through the blinds toward the old Hercules below. The old man still stood beneath the wing exactly where he had been from the beginning, rainwater drying slowly across his faded green parka beneath the fluorescent lights. He looked calm. Almost detached from the tension building around him. Sir, Ramirez asked carefully, who is he? Silence settled across the line again. Then the voice answered quietly. That information is above your clearance level. The call disconnected immediately after. Ramirez lowered the phone slowly while thunder rolled across the airfield outside hard enough to rattle the office windows. For several seconds he simply stood there staring down at the hangar floor below. Marines clustered near tool carts and maintenance scaffolds pretending to work while secretly watching the old man beneath the Hercules. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody even spoke above a whisper. Down on the floor, Corporal Ethan Briggs paced beside the aircraft nose wheel with growing frustration. This is insane, he muttered. One phone call and suddenly everybody acts like this guy is some legend. Pete Holloway folded his arms tighter against his chest. You should stop talking, son. Briggs shot him an irritated look. Why? Nobody here even knows what is real anymore. That is exactly why you should stop. The old man quietly lowered himself onto an overturned cargo crate beside his backpack. Every movement looked slow and deliberate, not because he was weak, but because he no longer wasted energy on unnecessary motion. The fluorescent lights overhead reflected softly across the silver streaks in his hair while the storm outside continued hammering the runway. Briggs stared at him for another long moment before finally walking closer again. This time there was less arrogance in his posture. More curiosity. More uncertainty. "What is your real name?" he asked. The old man rested his weathered hands together loosely. "Walter Hayes." "You military?" Briggs pressed. Walter looked at him calmly. "Once." Briggs frowned. "Air Force?" Walter gave a faint smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Not exactly." Before Briggs could ask another question, a sharp electronic chirp suddenly echoed through the hangar. Every Marine looked up immediately. The large digital operations board mounted above the maintenance bay had changed status colors. Green flight indicators across the screen switched abruptly to amber. Then red. Briggs blinked in confusion. "What the hell?" Pete Holloway stared upward with widening eyes. "That board only changes for command-level movement." Ramirez emerged from the office above and descended the metal staircase quickly, boots ringing sharply against each steel step. His face looked tighter now. Focused. "Everybody stay in the hangar," he ordered immediately. Briggs frowned. "Master Sergeant, what is going on?" Ramirez ignored the question and walked straight toward Walter Hayes. Marines instinctively stepped aside as he approached. The old man looked up at him without surprise. Ramirez lowered his voice. "Sir, command requests that you remain here for a little while longer." Walter studied him quietly. "I figured." Briggs looked completely lost now. "Wait a second," he said. "Command actually knows him?" Ramirez turned sharply. "Corporal, that is enough." The edge in his voice silenced Briggs instantly. Then something else happened. Outside the hangar, beyond the curtain of rain and runway mist, headlights appeared. Multiple vehicles. Dark SUVs moving fast across the wet tarmac toward Hangar 12. Their reflections shimmered across the rain-soaked concrete like pale ghosts beneath the storm. Several Marines slowly drifted toward the hangar entrance to look outside. Pete Holloway exhaled under his breath. "Oh no." Briggs stared through the rain. "Who are those guys?" Ramirez already knew. He could tell by the speed alone. Nobody drove like that on a military runway unless somebody very important was inside those vehicles. Walter Hayes remained seated beneath the Hercules wing, calm and silent while the approaching headlights grew brighter through the storm. Then, almost to himself, he spoke quietly enough that only Ramirez heard it. "They still move too fast in bad weather." Ramirez looked at him carefully. "Sir." Walter's eyes never left the convoy outside. "That habit used to drive me crazy." The convoy reached Hangar 12 fast enough to send sheets of water spraying across the runway behind the tires. Black SUVs cut through the storm in tight formation before stopping hard outside the massive hangar doors beneath flashing security lights. Engines idled low and heavy in the rain while every Marine inside the hangar instinctively straightened. Nobody had been ordered to stand at attention yet, but tension rolled through the building anyway like static electricity before lightning. Corporal Ethan Briggs stared toward the vehicles with widening eyes. "You have got to be kidding me." Master Sergeant Ramirez moved immediately. "Everybody clear the entrance," he ordered sharply. Marines stepped aside at once, boots scraping against concrete while the cold wind outside pushed mist and rainwater deeper into the hangar bay. Walter Hayes remained seated beneath the Hercules wing, calm and silent, his weathered hands resting loosely together while headlights reflected across the polished floor around him. The rear door of the lead SUV opened first. Two security personnel emerged into the rain wearing dark weather jackets with no visible insignia. Their eyes scanned the hangar instantly before one of them spoke quietly into a shoulder microphone. Then the second rear door opened. The entire atmosphere inside the building shifted. Lieutenant General Marcus Vane stepped out into the storm without an umbrella. Even through the rain and runway haze, his presence carried immediate weight. Tall. Gray-haired. Broad shoulders beneath a dark service coat already catching rainwater across the fabric. The younger Marines froze almost automatically. Briggs felt his stomach drop. Everybody on base knew who Marcus Vane was. Aviation Command. Decorated combat pilot. The kind of officer whose name traveled ahead of him long before he entered a room. Yet the general did not look at the Marine standing inside the hangar. He did not acknowledge Ramirez. He did not even glance toward the operations crews gathering near the maintenance bays. His eyes locked immediately onto the old man beneath the Hercules wing. Then something happened Briggs would remember for the rest of his life. General Marcus Vane walked straight through the rain into the hangar and stopped 10 feet from Walter Hayes. Complete silence swallowed the building. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Rain hissed against the runway outside. Somewhere deep inside the aircraft maintenance bay, a cooling engine ticked softly in the quiet. Then the general came to full attention. Perfect posture. Eyes forward. And slowly, deliberately, Lieutenant General Marcus Vane raised his hand in salute toward the homeless old man sitting beside the cargo crates. Nobody inside Hangar 12 moved. Nobody even breathed. Briggs felt cold spread through his chest so fast it almost hurt. Walter Hayes looked up at the general for several seconds without speaking. The two men held each other's gaze while storm light flickered faintly through the open hangar doors behind them. Then Walter slowly stood from the crate. Older now. Slower than he once was. But somehow the entire room seemed smaller the moment he rose to his feet. General Vane's expression shifted slightly. Not fear. Respect. Deep enough to become almost personal. Sir, the general said quietly. We searched for you for 11 years. Briggs nearly stopped breathing altogether. Around him, Marines stared in complete disbelief. Pete Holloway lowered his head slowly while Ramirez remained perfectly still beside the maintenance scaffolding. Walter looked past the general briefly toward the storm outside. You should not have, he answered softly. Vane shook his head once. We owed you more than that. Rainwater dripped steadily from the general's coat sleeves onto the concrete floor between them. Neither man seemed to notice. Briggs finally found his voice again, though it came out barely above a whisper. Who is he? No one answered him immediately. Walter's pale blue eyes drifted upward toward the Hercules aircraft above them, tracing the faded insignia near the cargo hatch once more. The old general followed his gaze silently. Then Marcus Vane spoke words that seemed to drain the remaining warmth from the entire hangar. Walter Hayes was the last extraction commander of Reaper Storm. A mechanic near the fuel cart quietly dropped his flashlight onto the floor. Nobody reacted. Nobody looked away from the old man beneath the aircraft. Walter simply stared at the faded insignia on the Hercules while thunder rolled across the runway outside and the storm kept pounding against the roof above them like distant rotor blades in the dark. The silence inside Hangar 12 no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt sacred. Rain continued pounding against the steel roof overhead while runway lights flickered through sheets of water outside the massive hangar doors. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Marines who had spent their entire careers around aircraft and command officers now stood frozen beside tool carts and maintenance scaffolds staring at the old man beneath the Hercules wing like history itself had just stepped out of the storm. General Marcus Vane slowly lowered his salute, but the respect in his posture never faded. Walter Hayes remained standing across from him beneath the faded insignia painted on the aircraft fuselage. For several long seconds the two men simply looked at one another while the distant hum of generators rolled softly through the bay. Then Walter finally spoke. You got taller. The general let out the faintest breath of a laugh. Not amusement. Relief. That is the first thing you say after disappearing for 11 years. Walter gave a small shrug. Seemed accurate. A few Marines exchanged stunned glances. Nobody expected the atmosphere to shift so suddenly. But something about the quiet exchange between the two men felt deeply human beneath all the mystery and tension surrounding them. Briggs stared openly now. "General," he asked carefully, "who exactly was Reaper Storm?" Ramirez shot him a warning look, but General Vane raised one hand slightly. It was enough to stop everyone else from interrupting. The general looked around the hangar slowly before answering. "Most of you have spent your careers hearing stories you assumed were myths," he said quietly. "Aircraft without call signs. Flights without manifests. Rescue operations that officially never happened." His eyes shifted back toward Walter. They were real. Thunder rolled outside again, low and distant. Walter looked uncomfortable now, almost irritated by the attention gathering around him. "Marcus," he said softly, "that is enough." But the general shook his head. "No, sir. It is not." He stepped slightly closer beneath the aircraft wing. "These Marines deserve to know why this aircraft still exists." Briggs listened without blinking. Around him, even the younger mechanics stood perfectly still. General Vane glanced upward toward the old Hercules overhead. 31 years ago, he said quietly, this aircraft vanished off military tracking systems for nearly 19 hours during a sandstorm operation over hostile territory. Walter closed his eyes briefly. The general continued anyway. Command believed the aircraft and everyone aboard were lost. Rainwater dripped steadily from the edge of the hangar roof while cold wind moved softly through the bay carrying the smell of wet jet fuel and concrete. Then at 3:17 in the morning, the general said, this Hercules landed back at base with half its navigation systems destroyed, both engines failing, and 42 stranded personnel alive inside. Nobody inside the hangar moved. Briggs felt chills crawl slowly across his arms. General Vane looked directly at him now. The man who brought them home was Walter Hayes. Briggs swallowed hard. He remembered every joke he had made earlier that night. Every insult. Every laugh. Suddenly they felt very small inside the cold metallic silence of the hangar. Walter stared down at the concrete floor. A lot of good men did not come back after that, he said quietly. Do not turn it into something bigger than it was. It already was, the general answered. The old man's jaw tightened slightly. Not anger. Pain. The kind buried too long to ever fully disappear. Pete Holloway lowered his eyes respectfully while several Marines near the maintenance bay unconsciously straightened their posture. Nobody saw Walter Hayes as homeless anymore. They saw something else entirely now. Something earned. General Vane slowly reached into the inside pocket of his rain-soaked service coat and removed a small weathered object wrapped carefully in cloth. He unfolded it with surprising care before holding it out toward Walter. It was an old metal flight badge. Scratched. Burned dark around the edges. Walter stared at it silently. We kept it waiting for you, the general said softly. For the first time all night, Walter Hayes looked genuinely shaken. Not by authority. Not by recognition. By memory. He reached out slowly with weathered fingers and took the badge from the general's hand while the storm continued raging outside and the old Hercules rested above them like a silent witness to everything they had survived. The old flight badge rested quietly in Walter Hayes's weathered hand while the storm outside finally began to weaken. Rain still tapped against the roof of Hangar 12, but softer now. Slower. The violent wind that had screamed across the runway earlier had faded into a low steady hiss beyond the massive hangar doors. Inside the building, nobody seemed willing to break the silence surrounding the old man beneath the Hercules wing. Walter studied the scratched metal badge for several long seconds beneath the fluorescent lights. His thumb brushed slowly across the burned edge like he was tracing fingerprints from another lifetime. Then he looked up at General Marcus Vane. You kept this all these years? Vane nodded once. It belonged to the last flight home. Walter exhaled quietly through his nose. Not quite a laugh. Not quite grief. Somewhere between the two. Around them, Marines stood frozen beside maintenance carts and scaffolding platforms while cold runway air drifted through the hangar carrying the smell of rain-soaked concrete and jet fuel. Corporal Ethan Briggs had not spoken in nearly 5 minutes. He simply stared at the old man he had mocked earlier that night and felt smaller every second the silence stretched on. Walter finally closed his fingers gently around the badge before slipping it carefully into the pocket of his faded parka. "I thought all of that was buried," he said softly. General Vane looked toward the old Hercules above them. "Some things do not stay buried." Walter followed his gaze. The faded insignia near the cargo hatch looked almost black beneath the pale overhead lighting now. "That aircraft should have been retired years ago," Walter murmured. Pete Holloway finally found his voice again. "Command tried twice." Walter glanced toward him with mild curiosity. Pete gave a nervous half-smile. "Both times the engines failed before transport." Several Marines exchanged uneasy looks immediately. Pete shrugged awkwardly. "I am just saying what happened." Walter looked back toward the Hercules and shook his head faintly. "She always hated being moved." The comment sounded so natural that for one strange moment the enormous aircraft felt less like a machine and more like an old living thing resting quietly in the center of the hangar. Briggs slowly stepped forward at last. His face had gone pale beneath the fluorescent lights. "Sir," he said quietly. Walter turned toward him. Briggs swallowed hard. "I did not know who you were." Walter studied him for a second before answering. "You were not supposed to." The young Marine lowered his eyes immediately. "Still should not have talked to you like that." Nobody moved while they waited for the old man's response. Walter looked at Briggs for another long moment, then slowly nodded once. "You remind me of somebody I used to know." Briggs blinked in surprise. "Really?" Walter's eyes drifted briefly toward General Vane beside him. "Cocky. Loud. Thought he knew everything at 23. For the first time all night, a faint smile crossed the general's face. Several Marines nearby let out quiet nervous breaths that almost sounded like laughter. The tension inside the hangar finally loosened slightly. Outside, the storm clouds had begun breaking apart above the runway. Cold moonlight slipped faintly through the rain mist beyond the hangar doors, reflecting silver across the wet tarmac. Walter reached down and picked up his old canvas backpack beside the cargo crates. The movement immediately changed the mood again. General Vane straightened slightly. "Sir," he said carefully, "you do not have to disappear again." Walter paused beneath the Hercules' wing. "Marcus," he answered softly, "men like me were always temporary." The general shook his head immediately. "Not to the people you brought home." Silence settled one final time across Hangar 12. Walter looked around slowly at the Marines, the mechanics, the old aircraft above them, and the storm fading outside the runway doors. Then he pulled the parka tighter around himself and started walking toward the exit. Nobody stopped him. Nobody dared. Marines instinctively stepped aside as he passed, their boots echoing softly against the concrete floor beneath the humming fluorescent lights. Corporal Briggs stood rigid near the hangar entrance while Walter moved past him into the cold night air. Just before disappearing into the rain mist outside, the old man stopped briefly without turning around. "Take care of her," he said quietly, glancing once toward the Hercules behind them. Then Walter Hayes walked out into the storm-dark runway and vanished beyond the lights while the entire hangar remained silent behind him. Because some legends do not ask to be remembered. They simply leave footprints too deep to disappear.